Welcome to this Young China Watchers webinar. My name is Raffaele Pantucci, and I'm delighted that you're joining us today for this webinar looking at China's borderland relations with Russia. And we're really delighted in this particular session to be joined by a really expert speaker on this topic, Dr. Alex Gabuev, or Alexander Sasha Gabuev, who is director of the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, based out of Berlin, and who is a long-time expert China-Russia watcher, who has a distinguished career both as an academic and previously as a journalist as well, and really looking at the core questions, and a deep sinologist, I would also add, who knows the ins and outs of both China, but also its neighborhood and its relationship with Russia in particular. This webinar is part of a series that we've been doing at Young China Watchers as part of our kind of global initiatives, looking at China's borderland relations. And we've already done sessions looking at Afghanistan, looking at India, and you can find these on our YouTube channel, where you can also find links to all of the Young China Watchers chapters around the world, and you can learn more about the organization, which now has 10 chapters all over the world, made up of young people interested in China. In all its different forms, looking both at foreign and security policy, which is what we're going to cover a lot of today, but also at cultural questions and other issues as well. And our chapters, sorts of activities, and I can come back to this later on, but do feel free to get in touch with Young China Watchers if you are not already signed up to join and participate in whichever chapter is nearest to you, as well as in our online activities. But today, what we wanted to do was to have a discussion about the China-Russia relationship. And we wanted to try to have this discussion focusing maybe on an aspect or through a lens that doesn't get the attention that we usually see around the China-Russia relationship. And that was trying to think a little bit about the borderlands that the two countries share. Now, these borderlands that China and Russia share are fascinating parts of the world to visit, for one thing, but are also fascinating in historical terms because they've been so flexible and they've moved and changed so much over time. So, of course, during the Soviet Union, China and Russia shared a very long border that then, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly shrunk dramatically to become only the part of China and Russia that coincided at Heilongjiang and the Amur region. The rest, of course, in the middle became Central Asia and the independent countries of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. But what we wanted to try to focus on here was more that specific border relationship and more how that impacts the wider geopolitical relationship between these two countries, which, as you all know, has become incredibly close over the past few years, both driven in part by the war in Ukraine, but actually because of drivers that I think we're going to get into more that go back far deeper than that. And we're really delighted and honored that Alex Gabuev has taken time out of his very busy schedule in Berlin to come and talk to us about this. Just before I switch over to Sasha to get going on our first question, I would just say to our audience, if you have any questions you want to put to, or any comments you'd like to make, please feel free to feed them into the Q&A function, not the chat box, the Q&A function, and I will pick them up as you go along. And we're very keen that this is a dialogue. So I will pitch questions to Sasha to get the discussion going, but then I'm happy to bring in questions or points as people raise them using the Q&A function. So without further ado, Sasha, we've been hearing a lot from me doing lots of lengthy introducing, but I wonder if we could start by maybe talking about where China and Russia meet on the ground. And I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit the actual borderland relationships that the two countries share.
Thanks, Raf, and it's great to be with this terrific crowd. I'm a big fan of the network and what you and others are doing for Young China Watchers. It's too long over the pandemic that we haven't done this in person, but I think that in-person events come. Does Berlin have a Young China Watcher chapter? It should.
It does indeed. It does indeed. Okay, and perfect. They will hopefully now be sure to connect with you after this particular session. Perfect. But yes, they are certainly there.
Okay, so we have a very lengthy border that China has with Russia, and Russia has with China. For Russia, it's the second the longest border after its border with Kazakhstan. For China, it's also the border. I think that the border with India is longer, the border with Mongolia is longer, but nevertheless, that's of paramount importance. And indeed, from the times when the borders were not very clearly defined up until late modern age, that's where the two empires have collided in a space that was not entirely clearly defined. Because I think that the borders that we see right now on the maps, very clearly defined, demarcated, were not the borders that we had during the Qing and Romanov empires. When you travel to China's Dongbei or to Russia's Far East, you will see a lot of kind of very complicated memories out there. Most likely the Chinese expeditions to establish the border of the Qin, to kind of colonize indigenous populations arrived earlier than the Russians. If you go to Vladivostok, to the History Museum, the first floor is dedicated to kind of the earliest material objects in the Russian Far East. And a lot of them are in Chinese. So there are stelas for various expeditions that Qing official overtook. Well, the Russian narrative would be that that was not really the border back then. The Chinese came first on the exploration missions. Probably some local tribes sent a couple of furs to the Qing court, expecting lavish gifts. But that was a territory that was not really part of China, that was dependent on China. Probably China had economic cultural penetration there, but it was not a territory of China. Nevertheless, over some decades of contests with the Russian Cossacks coming in and Chinese pushing them out, Qing dynasty established controls, and then through part of the colonial treaties like treaties of Aigun and Beijing, we saw this land being ceded to Russian Empire first, and then the Soviet Union. And over a pretty lengthy period of time, during the flourishing of Sino-Soviet friendship in the initial years of PRC establishment, where the Soviet Union was Sulian Dake, like the elder brother Soviet Union, it all went fine until the Sino-Soviet split. And that's when the territorial dispute was brought up, when Russia, Soviet Union back then, and China had two border incidents, quite deadly, one on the Russia-China segment of the border right now, and the other, the Kazakhstan segment of the border. And then in mid-80s, when two pragmatic leaderships arrived in both the Kremlin and Junanhai. In Junanhai, that was team de facto led by Deng Xiaoping. In the Kremlin, that were actually predecessors of Mikhail Gorbachev, so Yuri Andropov and then Chernenko, have looked into the idea that we should actually normalize ties with China. The geopolitical rivalry over, ideological rivalry over who is the top boss in the communist bloc is gone. Both countries try to embark on modernization projects, deep economic reforms, and also some limited political reforms of the Soviet Union. And they realized that just two nuclear superpowers facing each other and being stuck in territorial disputes where their real security obsessions lie elsewhere is just a waste of resources. It costs so much time, money, and creates so much risk that there should be a way to, find out and negotiate. And that's where Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping's team embarked on this resolution. Then the Soviet Union obviously collapsed. And then this job was picked up by teams of Jiang Zemin and Boris Yeltsin. And then Jiang Zemin settled this in with Putin in 2001. And the job was finished by Hu Jintao administration when Putin, of course, was still around. So by late 2006, we had the border demarcated. China obviously has ceded some territories that it could have claimed without leading to resolution. But then both sides decided that, okay, we go under internationally recognized rules that the middle level of the Amur River should be the border. And then China relinquished its claims for, in Deng Xiaoping's description, onto 1 million square kilometers. And they said, okay, let's turn the page. And by the way, that was the first time that China has really successfully settled a territorial dispute with its neighbor. Russia was actively helping the Central Asian states to settle their territorial disputes and demarcate the border. That happened later on. But I think that for China back then, that was really very necessary to just remove this unpredictability and clarity about a giant northern neighbor, also nuclear armed, despite the Soviet collapse, still a formidable military power, and just, focus a lot of domestic resources on economic modernization, 改革开放, and the PLA modernization was really focused much more on the maritime theater. I think that if we go to current day and age, just two last points, for a very long time, there was a lot of bottom-up activity going in the region, cross-border. Russia experienced very painful economic reforms, was opening up to the outside world, and was seeking ways to survive while the money was not really coming in abundance from Moscow as they used to be. And a lot of the plants and company towns that thrived under Soviet rule with a planned economy went really downhill because of the economic downturn. So the locals had to survive, and they started this cross-border trade, which you sometimes would dub as smuggling, to Japan, South Korea, but also China. And in China, it was also a period of economic opportunity. We know that Dongbei is not necessarily the most developed part of China, but definitely this cross-border trade with Russia was one of the source of thriving. So that was bottom up. I think that on the official level, both states moved to solve the territorial issue, demilitarize the border, but this long-term distrust was there, particularly on the Russian side. If you look that the Russian Far Eastern region is about 1/3 of Russian territory and just 6.2 million population, whereas all of Dongbei would be about 120 million people, you understand the unease with which Russia looked at this. And back in the day, a lot of inertial thinking like, oh, China is so big, probably this populated country needs land, and we should be very much on our guard. That prevented a lot of the economic opportunities there. The sea change, to my mind, came in 2014 and later on in 2020 and then 2022 in 3 stages. What happened in 2014 is that after Russia's annexation of Crimea, downing of MH17 and Western sanctions, Russia really decided to pivot to the east, to China. And the Russian government did a pretty meticulous cross-agency, interagency study on what the risks are. And people looked very carefully in the Kremlin into this risk of, okay, what about this symmetry in the Far East? And the conclusion was that, hey, China is, yes, a demographic superior country. That's many, many more people in this part of the region, but it's an aging society. And by 2040, the population will start to decrease. It just doesn't have the demographic potential to be aggressive or seeking new land. And by the way, China's GDP in double-digit growth. Its real disposable incomes, its salaries are growing far more rapidly than in Russia. So over time, the incentive to go and seek employment in Russia and stuff is decreasing. China has so many more attractive jobs opening in coastal provinces, in heartland provinces, but also in Dongbei, where there was this effort, you remember, to revive the Laogongye, like the old industrial base there. That's where the Russians like, okay, probably there is not that much pragmatic reason for China to be really encroaching. Probably demographically, that's not a big risk. And that's where Russia get much more relaxed about, reopening cross-border ties, building cross-border infrastructure, all of these bridges and stuff. And that's where people in the Far East who were torn, like a lot of them had experience of China, they did business with China and were quite okay. A lot of them were still very about kind of Chinese presence in the region. They got much more focused on labor migrants from Central Asia, like, oh, this Muslims, like these people who look very differently and are like, oh, we don't like them. And China is quite okay. Then the pandemic came, and whatever was the Chinese population, most of the people went back to China. And a lot of jobs that China took in the Russian Far East, including sophisticated manufacturing or kind of piloting sophisticated agricultural machinery, was replaced by the Russians. So once now the countries are going back into post-COVID reopening, and Russia is heavily sanctioned, and China is the only major economic partner, which as of last year constituted 30% of Russian exports and 40% of Russian exports. Definitely, this is the region where the Russians try to leverage their geographic proximity to China, ability of natural resources, arable land, and really want to open the region as much to China as possible. China, at the same time, is not probably as needy. I think that priorities lie elsewhere. But also, given that the state of the Chinese economy is not doing great, probably the rebounding of economic activity after the pandemic doesn't meet the state council's expectations. And if there might be some regional drivers for economic prosperity, and cross-border trade and investment with Russia could be one of them, that's something that China wants to tap. So I think that now it becomes, again, one of the spots where there is a lot of attention from both Beijing and Moscow, where there is a lot of local activity and a local entrepreneurship. Problem is that on the Russian side and on the Chinese side, these are not two the most developed regions in both countries. Like it's definitely not Pearl Delta. It's definitely not Jiangnan, so it's not Shanghai, Zhejiang populated area. And in Russia, it's definitely not the kind of Tatarstan or developed urban centers. But I think that there will be a lot of kind of local entrepreneurship and also a lot of top-down focus from the governments. I'll stop here and happy to go in whatever direction is useful.
No, that was fascinating. I mean, you did a spectacular job of taking us all the way back from the early dynasties right up till today and giving us that arc. I guess one point I'd love to pick up a little bit more on is the emotive component of it, which you hear a lot from, I think, or you can read a lot in Russian texts and sources previously. I mean, I think it was President Putin who in about 2000 gave a very emotional speech saying we're going to lose the East, and in my experience reading about this in the sort of mid-2010s when I was doing a particular lot of travel in Central Asia, I was struck by how much people would talk. I went visiting up to these parts of Heilongjiang, and I found people there were quite wary, and there was a real kind of emotional skepticism, if you will. And I wonder how you see that. Has that changed, in particular on the Russian side, where I really had a strong sense, and you hinted it a little bit in your comments about how much that kind of fear of China and Sinophobia, while the Kremlin may have come to terms with it and have a logical answer, do you think that is true on the ground, or is there still that kind of emotional tension?
I think that we don't have really good field work recently that would cover kind of popular opinion and stuff. We hope to be able to do that at Carnegie at some point, just to do focus group and to do sociology, because like nobody has revisited this for quite some time. And then all of the evidence we have is sporadic. My impression reading academic works of peers in Russia and in China, and then being able to travel there before the pandemic, my last time in the region was in 2020, on the Russian side, and I haven't been to Heilongjiang for quite some time, actually, since 2015, I think. So my knowledge is dated, which I need to admit. I think that on the Russian side, people were much more having a real-time experience with China. because for Vladivostok, China, particularly Sunfenghe, which is like 200 kilometers away, was a very frequent weekend destination. Like you want to go to a nice hotel to celebrate a wedding or a birthday or whatever, you go to Heilongjiang. You go for shopping, you go to Heilongjiang, to Sunfenghe, and not Dunning sometimes, like Mudanjiang if you want to see a big kind of city. But that was just very much normalized. And then that's where the ruble was strong. And then after 2014, we had a change in the directions where ruble got weakened as a result of devaluation and collapse of the oil price, and to a limited extent with Western sanctions. And all of a sudden, strong RMB, and you remember that RMB got stronger around that time, provided Chinese with a lot of purchasing power. So they started to go to the Far East. And that's where the Russian Far East got a lot of experience of Chinese tourism, who suddenly came to buy stuff or spend, vacation on Lake Baikal, or spend their money in Casino Tiger de Cristal, owned by Stanley Ho's family, or partially owned by Stanley Ho's family. Right? Gambling is forbidden in China officially, except for Macau. So that was one of the destinations that attracted some moneyed Chinese tourists. Again, and gambling was forbidden in Russia, with the exception for 4 zones, and one of them was in the Far East, targeted at Chinese tourists. So the two people got much more face-to-face experience. By the time it was clear that Chinese labor is becoming an expensive, sophisticated labor that is just not doing any type of simple work, these jobs went to North Koreans and people from Central Asia. And Chinese were really skilled workers in agriculture, particularly operating sophisticated machinery, construction, cross-border trade. That's about it. So the people who were there permanently, their number has decreased, number of tourists has increased. And I think that by and large, my experience was that the people are pretty positive. They're like, yeah, they're neighbors. They care about themselves. Like they're sometimes loud and uncultural and stuff, but we can make money. That's great. When it came to some really touchy subjects like Lake Baikal and protection of environment there, and sometimes long lease of arable land to China, that's where the local communities have become defensive. Like, oh, China will come and poison the land, or drink all of the Lake of Baikal, or hunt for all of the fishes. And that was something that got anti-China's sentiment back, but that was temporarily, like that was dying down. And overall, I think that the two communities on both sides of the border were really kind of moving closer to each other. The historic memory was there. The Russians all the time, every year, celebrated this defense of Damansky, and for the local military, that's important. In China, the History Museum in Heilongjiang that documents all of the atrocities, commitment towards Chinese population by the imperial Russian government, including like the episode when thousands of Chinese were killed in Amur, when Russia had this suspicion over everybody of Asian origin before war with Japan. That's there, and that's still part of the school curriculum. But I think that there is a desire on both sides not to kind of fix it permanently, but just to turn the page and say, okay, we leave it to historians. We remember about the dark pages of the past, but there is a political will not really to open them and score this historic scores, and not go back to that and focus on present and the future.
Fascinating. And I see we've already started to get some questions in, so I would encourage other members of the audience to please put them in. Nathan, I will come to yours in 1 minute. I just want to pick up one final question for myself, and then I'll start to pull in Nathan's and any others that people have. So please feel free to put them in. I guess the last component of this I'm quite interested to hear a bit about is human movement and dynamics, because I know that the fear which you were just articulating a little bit was about this fear of lots of Chinese. And I think you made a very compelling case as to why that's not really happened and why it's not maybe. But I wonder, I suppose, in the longer term, if I think about those dynamics you're talking about that the Kremlin had sort of identified, then logically there could be an attraction to move to China. And I know certainly one of the issues you've seen in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine in 22 last year was this exflow of Russians. And, you know, I know from recent travels around Central Asia, there's a lot who moved there. I think a lot then went on further. I'm wondering how much there was a human flow across this border, or if there had been previously. I mean, previously, of course, we were in the pandemic, so China was completely sealed off and it was impossible. But I'm wondering about that human flow from Russia into China specifically.
So let's go to the China side first. I think that we saw some people who went to work and then sought permanent residence in China in the 90s and then the first decade of this century. And then the flow reverted. So there were some permanent residents of Russia still of Chinese origin who are PRC citizens and are there like in cross-border trade and stuff, or have families there. Like there are cases of mixed marriages that are not as widespread, but there are some mixed couples. And then at the turn of this century, going to be educated in China and go to seek employment, I think became really trendy in Russia. So there were a lot of people who went to get their degrees in China. China was really engaged in spending big on this to internationalize their campuses, to have more white faces there, and just to promote Chinese economic development and a model. So for people who studied Chinese, that became just very normal to go for 1 year or 2 years to universities, not only in Dongbei, but all across China. I was in Hangzhou at Zhejiang Daxue in 2005-2006. And I had 4 kind of terrific female fellow colleagues coming from Vladivostok. Right, and like one of them is a longtime friend, married to one of the best Russian China watchers, Ivan Zuyenko, who is also comes from Vladivostok. So there are a lot of kind of connections built even among Russians educated in China. And I think that the community was really big, but even before COVID, a lot of these people started to leave China and go back to Russia. And I think that the sense I got in this community is that life is getting increasingly restricted. China gets increasingly less friendly towards foreigners in general, or you needed to be a very high-skilled person working for McKinsey or for a chip factory like Shanghai Chips Manufacturing Factory or something like this, where China would create a bubble for you to feel comfortable. Everybody else was thinking that China is becoming very expensive, increasingly expensive. The education is becoming expensive. Inflation is a real thing. And then the competition, because slower growth of the economy, is getting really intense. So a lot of Chinese young graduates who go and hunt for this job. And in Dongbei in particular, a lot of ethnic Chinese who speak wonderful Russian, who just graduate from this programs, which are legacy of China watching the collapse of the Soviet Union and studying the Northern brother. So they are taking all of these jobs. And a lot of people I knew came back to Russia. So with the pandemic, the wave of people who fled first the war and then mobilization was limited. People couldn't go there. And now we see a lot of resumption of just normal commercial ties, a lot of delegations going there, a lot of official delegations are going there, particularly since the big boss went to Moscow. They gave the blessing for all of the lower level officials, just go and meet your Chinese counterparts. And now the delegations are there all the time. Today we have Minister of Emergencies and former Putin's bodyguard, by the way, visiting China and shaking hands with his Chinese counterpart. But I don't pulp at this point this big flow of Russian emigres. There are many more people who go to Central Asia Turkey, Europe, and even Argentina trying to kind of hide from this war rather than to China. And that's explained by kind of language environment. In Central Asia, majority of the big cities are still pretty much Russian speaking. Cultural affinity, and yeah, I think that all of the disadvantages of being foreigner in a post-COVID China are still there.
Yeah, fascinating. Fascinating to hear that even amongst the Russian community, which I think people might interpret would be much more comfortable, there is that same kind of pressure and tension that I think lots of other foreign expat communities in China have felt over the
And
past
it's not
few
that
years.
people are kind of thinking like, oh, I'm the next Mike Kovrig. That's
Right.
not about politics, but it's just much more about societal pressure where the economic growth goes down, cost of living goes up, bringing up kids. A lot of people went there in their early 20s where you were kind of youngish and attractive and drinking in the Sanlitun or whatever other foreigner-friendly districts was fun. But as people kind of move in their mid-30s, they have families, they have kids, they think that, do I want my kid to grow up like a real Zhongguoren, or do I want them to grow up in my country, particularly since good education is so expensive in China? I'll probably go back.
Yeah, no, everything has become more complicated. I'm going to start switching over to some of the questions, and I see we've got some really interesting ones that have come in. And I'd encourage again the audience, if you do have any, please feel free to feed them in. I'll start off with Nathan, who asked his question first, and so is justifiably asking it first. So he asks, do you think that border disputes could re-emerge on the Sino-Russian border in the future, and why?
I think that the probability is very, very low. But I think that the risk is not zero. And the risk might materialize in two cases. One is that the Chinese system at some point becomes less governable and more populist or open to whatever popular opinion there is. We know that China is pretty nationalistic. Of course, a lot of zeal is directed at Taiwan, South China Sea. But again, since the issue is more swept under the carpet rather than fully resolved, and I think that it's a broader point whether China can say, hey, whatever was the century of humiliation is over. In a global system, China was probably never as powerful, like in a global context. Of course, you go back to the Tang Dynasty and stuff, but like that's where the world was really separate universes with very, very, very limited link. In a global village, China was just never such a powerhouse. And then, well, why should we be obsessed with Diao Yudao? This is a bunch of rocks. And right, we can live with status quo with Taiwan and stuff. We don't need more territory. China is big enough. What we really need is investment, prosperity, knowledge, markets, and we're going to compete with the Yangui's on who fixes the climate first, or who sends a space mission to Alpha Centauri, or whatever, right? That's how we're going to lead to great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. If that's the way the Chinese leadership frames competition with the outside world and says like, who would be interested in a bunch of unlivable rocks up in Himalayas, right? It would be a different ballgame. But since a lot of this century humiliation legacy is there, and like this cult of territorial integrity, not one inch of the motherland should go to the foreigners and stuff, Russia is still there because, yes, it's officially resolved, but we know from history textbooks that the Russians stole a lot of land. And whether there will be at some point a more populist leadership that would just allow this discussion to happen and lead to very rapid cementing of a popular opinion that, oh, we should, by the way, Russia is 100% our resource colony. And we should reopen this question because why are we, not returning this territory to us? It's very, very, very unlikely. But I think that the risk is not zero. And then the other scenario is we don't know which way the situation in Russia will develop. I think that the risk of breakup of the country is very low at this point. There might be turmoil after Putin finally leaves the stage, and I hope he's mortal. He should be, right? I guess. We don't know, but
Unfortunately, I think we all are, right? Even him, as much as he might wish
no,
not to
no,
be.
that's fine with me. I'm okay to be mortal. I hope that he is, and that he vacates his seat at some point. It can be 20 years down the road. Who knows?
Yeah.
Mugabe was really old when he was
He
finally
clung on. 91,
removed
I
from
think.
his chair. But nevertheless, so we don't know what the transition will look like. I think that the chances that the system will reinvent itself, and after death of Stalin, we're going to have collective leadership with somebody like Khrushchev or anybody running the place is high. But then a much more messy transition that leads to actual fragmentation is also not totally impossible at this point. And then if, for example, Tuva wants to break free, and then there is gradual fracturing of Russia, and there are a bunch of weaker states, and some of them maybe not having nuclear weapons, like Tuva doesn't. That might be probably, depending on what happens in China, a point where, somebody in China would say, oh, by the way, and this is an all Chinese land, and we should do something about it. Again, very low probability, but high impact, and definitely looking into these scenarios is an interesting intellectual exercise.
I guess building maybe on that, I'll pick up on the question that Jacob's put, which kind of touches a bit, you've already kind of covered it a bit, where he asks, what if the Russian army is soundly defeated in Ukraine? Might this be something that the Chinese interpret as an opportunity to kind of step in? So it kind of builds on what you were just saying, but rather than thinking about it from the kind of Russian perspective, do you think, I know you talked about the sort of nationalist vibe in Beijing being stoked at the moment. Do you think that you see there's a chance that Russia might move in to some of the Far East because it sees an opportunity?
Russia is a nuclear armed state, and I think that we are talking about internationally recognized territory of Russia proper. I think that doing this would lead to a big risk of nuclear escalation. We don't know whether Russia will or will not use nukes in Ukraine. And I would be in the school of thought saying that the risk is not zero, unfortunately. And it's unpredictable, and it's tied to Mr. Putin's emotionality and the way that he frames this war as existential for Russia, for his regime, and for himself. So we don't know where these red lines are, but the fact that Russia is doing miserably in this ugly war, which is a good thing, is not to suggest that Russia doesn't have any red lines and the Ukrainians should just march all the way to internationally recognized borders without any consideration of risk of Russia's nuclear escalation. And unfortunately, we've seen conventional escalation with this explosion of Kakhovskaya Dam, like a lot of terrible, ugly stuff that Russia did to kind of make Ukrainian advance slower and less successful. So if it deals with Russia's proper territory, I think that the risk of nuclear escalation is there. Whether Chinese army will be in a technological position to shoot down all of the Russian missiles, I don't know. But imagine a risk of 5% chance of nuclear strike on Mudanjian. Who would risk that? What's the need for China? It has Russia as a partner that's ready to give access to all of the natural resources that China wants. China sets the price. China purchases these raw materials in RMB. 80% of China-Russia trade is settled in RMB and rubles, but bulk is in RMB. And by the way, Russia trades with India. Russia sells its oil to India in RMB and now pays dividends to Japanese shareholders of Russia's oil and gas projects in Sakhalin in RMB as well. So there is plenty to like in the current status, and keeping Russia defeated or humiliated and weakened, but afloat in the current form and shape gives so much more to China than, any move that entails big military risks of kind of death of millions of Chinese, frankly, And that would change the geopolitical dynamics dramatically because all of the alienation from Russia will not necessarily disappear, but there will be so much more sympathy and desire to sanction China and punish China for doing this brazen move. So I just cannot imagine a rational leader in Junanhai ordering something like this.
A pretty compelling case, I think that you make. I mean, one of the fears I've often found, and now moving maybe a little away from the Borderlands discussion, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on it, is a fear in Beijing that actually what might happen is Russia might go Western, if you will. And this is something I've long heard sort of from Chinese experts and officials that I've had a chance to speak to, where they express this kind of concern that, well, is Russia really a truly dependable ally? Now, in the current context, it's difficult to see that happening given the war in Ukraine and the tensions between Russia, but, things could change. And I wonder how much you think that could, do you see a path in which that could happen in the near future? And do you think Beijing still really considers that as a major risk factor?
I think that Beijing for now considers risk factor of the war going in unpredictable direction in Ukraine and China being held culpable for that by the West, like saying, oh, you enable Putin to do this and that. And that's where China needs to be very careful in creating expectations. Like you saw the article in FT yesterday when Xi Jinping and the whole system are parading their glorious achievement that, oh, Putin is not using nukes because we told him not to use nukes. I don't think that Putin is not using nukes precisely because of this reason. I think that it's the ultimate insurance he has from losing this war big time. So you don't use this ultimate tool unless you're really forced to. And so far, as miserably as this war goes for Russia, it's really not as ugly as people might hope. Unfortunately, it's manageable and it more reminds you Iran-Iraq, 9 years of conflict rather than swift victory for Ukraine, as much as people would hope for that. So I think that's the major risk, but definitely a risk that should there be a sudden change of government in Russia and a democratic opposition comes to power and they decide, oh, we are just surrendering all of these territories, please remove sanctions and take us under Western umbrella, that the West will be also driving that because we are in a very different stage of US-China competition. And that the compelling logic in the United States would be like, oh, let's go back to the Kissingerian triangle, reverse to an extent. Let's take Russia out of the cold, since they're willing to give all of these concessions, and let's make sure that Russia is now anchored in the transatlantic community, whatever. And you will find a lot of people in the Russian opposition, like Garry Kasparov, the chess player, and other people who would say like, oh, but China is the biggest threat to Russia going forward, and like we are getting so dependent on China that we definitely should go back to the European family. China is busy building this long-term dependency on itself, like reorienting Russian economy, building tech dependency, building financial dependency, and also being more visible in Russian culture, I would say, parading the Chinese model as an alternative to Western model, and also making the Russian elite feeling welcome to an extent. Allowing them to open bank accounts, allowing them to buy vacation properties. So this is something to watch. We don't know how it will end. I know a lot of people in the Russian democratic opposition will say, yeah, like we should go back to normal relationship with the West. But by the way, turning our back on China is suicidal. And we should be pragmatic, and we definitely should not be dragged into this spat between the West and China, and we should be neutral here. So a lot of opinions, even among Russians in exile.
Fascinating. So Kyle, who says, good morning from Boston, which is Great to see how international our audience participants are. He asks about how Russia views the Belt and Road Initiative, considering the importance that it places specifically on former Soviet republics. Is it seen as an opportunity, or is it seen in a more adversarial light?
Well, I think that we haven't heard strongly about Belt and Road recently. It's not as pronounced. It's still there, of course. Like
The
there was.
ASEAN summit with the Central Asian leaders, it was proudly trumpeted around a few times.
That's true, and that's the first kind of Central Asia China summit. But I think that, and we're going to have most likely a Belt and Road forum in October in Beijing, and Vladimir Putin will be a guest of honor. But whether Belt and Road is just as much a central piece of Xi Jinping's foreign policy thought compared to his global security initiative and other pillars which are much more focused on normative setting norms, I think that Belt and Road narrative is tarnished, and China is kind of very carefully parking it and coming up with other narrative formations. Russia was skeptical about Belt and Road Initiative initially when it was unveiled in 2013. Of course, it started in Central Asia, and there was all these concerns about China encroaching on our territory, like or our sphere of privileged interest, to use the Russian slang for that. And then in 2014, I think that the attitude has changed, and the Russians said, okay, like China wants to exercise its geopolitical power in this region and around the world. It's not only about Central Asia, but it's really global in nature. Okay, let's try to hedge against the risks. Let's to create something which projects a symbolic equivalence, and we say, there's going to be not us joining and subscribing to Belt and Road, but there's going to be so-called docking, 对接, or сопряжение in Russian, between the Belt and Road and the Eurasian Economic Union. And like a lot of intellectual energy was spent on this docking. And then Russia came out with its own kind of greater Eurasia initiative. That's basically to say, oh, China, you have Belt and Road, we have this greater Eurasia thing. And like that's symbolic equilibrium there. But by the way, if you want to invest in that and that and that and that infrastructure project, or be shareholder or this or that coal mine or oil field, you're welcome to do that. So I think that we've seen de facto a big development of China-Russia ties, particularly in trade, not as much as in investment, but definitely in trade. But that all happened outside of the scope of Belt and Road. And sometimes this Belt and Road gift paper was wrapped around some projects. But I remember very well that every project that Russians tried to pitch in Beijing were part of the Belt and Road. And that Chinese were like, yeah, thank you so much for reciting how glorious our leader is and how great our Idailu is. But by the way, let's look into the books of your project. Does it have a sustainable financial model? Like, is it actually investable? And I think that you see a big degree of caution that Chinese financial authorities have exercised since around 2015. I think that there is just much bigger amount of caution and prudence going in approving many of the projects overseas, well, unless they are not tech that China needs. But like resource projects, infrastructure building, not everything gets green lighted by NDRC. And I think that's a prudent, sound approach. China is deep pocketed, but its pockets also have real bottoms and holes, by the way.
Yeah, I think they discovered that Belt and Road was a bit of a leaky bucket, aside from anything else in terms of cash. But actually thinking a bit about this, and before I come to the final question that someone's put up, and if anyone else has any more questions, now would be the moment to type them in, because we're coming towards the end of our session. I suppose now might be the moment that Russia actually wants more of that kind of big ticket infrastructure investment, given the cutting off that they've had from the West and the kind of concatenation effect that has to investment from other countries who are wary of investing in a sanctioned place, and falling foul of, the US in particular and the EU sort of sanctions reach. So could we be in a moment where actually Russia would like more Belt and Road, but is going to find it's going to struggle to get more of it because China is being much more circumspect about its kind of Belt and Road investment?
I agree. And I think that the reason you provide is compelling. But another reason is that China is just very careful about managing and navigating the sanctions. The sanctions are having a snowball effect, like just dozens and dozens and dozens of Russian entities and people are thrown into the sanctions blacklist every month. Europe is now with 11th sanctions package working on the 12th sanctions package, and that becomes a cottage industry in itself. So navigating the sanctions landscape gets increasingly tricky, increasingly expensive in terms of compliance, particularly for large companies that have global visibility and are part of global supply chains. It's one thing if you are kind of mid-level enterprise with turnover of billions on US dollars, but still you're based somewhere in Hunan or Heilongjiang, and like you're doing something that's below the radar. And it's very difficult if you are very big visible company like Xiaomi or Huawei. We see that there is some distancing. And I think that both kind of desire from the state and from the financial authorities in China to be prudent in the way they approve this financing and loan. The desire of Chinese companies to navigate the sanctions against Russia in a smart way. And also desire of China to just not be portrayed as this big brother that underwrites Putin's war checks. Right. Is there, which makes this trade relationship flourishing. But also on the investment side, I think that China is just increasingly cautious. There might be a point in time when the war is over, probably, or at least the big shooting is over. The US moves with more aggressive sanctions. So some Chinese companies decide, oh, we have nothing to lose. We're sanctioned already. So we do more with Russia. But I think that at this time, there is a point of caution where China prefers this flexible trade relationships rather than putting investment inside Russia.
Thank you. And I see Gwen took advantage of my call to put a question in quickly. So I'm going to take the last two questions that we have together and I'll let you answer them together. And also if you have any kind of final points that you want to make to us in the last 5 minutes of what's been a really, really interesting discussion. The first one is from Han Shito, which I'm sure is a real name, who asked the question of how has the Chinese government changed its policy to Russia after the coup? I presume we're talking about the events that we saw with Mr. Prigozhin over, I'm forgetting if it's last weekend or the weekend before. So that's question one. Has China changed its policy towards Russia in the wake of that? Or if you could talk us through your sense of what happened there. And then Gwen has asked just how holy, and that's not holy in the religious sense, but holy like in porous, is the border with regard to sanctions, war sanctions in particular that we see? Because I know we've seen lots of discussion increasingly in the media about the degree to which products may be coming from, maybe evading sanctions to Russia via other borders, via Central Asia or via China. So how much do we see that border actually being used as a site or place for sanctions evasion? Over to you.
So on the first, I don't see any material change. I think that China took a very predictable degree of caution. They have their own experience during the 1991 coup. The Chinese ambassador went to see this junta and congratulate them on taking the power. And then in a matter of 2 days, the junta was gone. And then China was somewhat embarrassed. So they know that you should watch that with a degree of caution. I think that the events unfolded rapidly, but then the coup was gun, or like that was mutiny. That was not really a coup. The guys didn't charge, or the supreme authority. They had to imagine that as a demonstration of armed truck drivers who are going to the capital and say, we want pay raise. No way we're going to tolerate this. It's something like that, except what these are not truck drivers, but thousands of armed mercenaries shooting down government helicopters, and by the way, getting away with that. It's Russia. Not that I thought that I would see something like this, but I also wouldn't blow this out of proportion. There is a tendency to kind of get hyperventilation and pin our hopes that, oh, finally somebody gets Mr. Putin hanging on one of the Kremlin's towers, and it's not going to happen soon, I'm afraid. So I think that China was watching carefully, and just watching it last week, everything went back to normal. Chinese diplomats were traveling to Moscow to talk missile defense and space weapons. Russian Deputy Prime Minister visited China last Friday to talk about industrial cooperation. Again, Minister of Emergencies is there today. So it's a business of usual. And I think that China has a vital interest to keep Mr. Putin in place. And they cannot fix his Prigozhin problem, just as they couldn't fix Takayev's problem by sending thousands of Russian or Kazakh speaking paratroopers. And it's good that Russia had some Russian speaking paratroopers to help out there. But where they can help Putin, they can help his system to stay afloat economically. And that's why they will provide him with access to our liquidity, will continue to buy oil and gas, and will provide him with sophisticated chips. And they also can keep his military machine without violating the sanctions directly, sending all of this dual good use that he has power to carry on. They're agnostic where the front line is, but they are really keen that he doesn't leave the job because of this. And Russia is not democratized. How holy is the border? I think it is holy, but there is a desire on both sides to hide some of the supplies, and just the trade amount is so big now. Last year it was 190 billion. I think that this year we're going to see substantial growth. So there is easy to hype 1 billion chips here and there, and also make it less traceable. Since Russia closed its custom statistics, it's even easier right now. And we have, thanks to the US intelligence community that sometimes has information and shares it with major global media like Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. But other than that, there are just tiny little bites of what we can know realistically.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much, Alex, Sasha, for taking time to speak to us. It's been a really excellent hour. And I really appreciate you taking us through, the history in great detail, right up to the kind of present day, and touching on some of the big issues and how this ties into the kind of current geopolitical picture, because I think it is one of the more underexplored elements of the China-Russia relationship, which has become even less explored now, given the kind of global geopolitical tensions, and everyone's kind of obsessed with, criminology and peaconology and how these two interact. We're actually thinking about the there and where the two countries actually meet. So thank you so much for taking us through it so expertly. It's hugely appreciated. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that you asked the question if we have a chapter in Berlin, to say yes, of course we do, as I said before, and I'm sure you will. I will ensure that they connect with you. I'm sure they're very keen to. But I'd also emphasize that we have got chapters all over the world, in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, here in Singapore where I am, and then in Europe, in London, as well as over in the United States, in New York, in Washington, and in San Francisco. So if you're near any of these cities, please get in touch, join up. If you are not, sign up, join some of the events that we run like this online. Check out the blog, check out the YouTube channel, check out our podcasts. We've got a wonderful team that sets these things up, and I have to give a nod to Sam Colomby, who's our global director for communications, and I apologize, Sam, if I just got your title wrong, and Josh Cartwright, who works very closely with him on that, who have both helped set this whole session up. The event has been recorded. It will be available online if you want to listen to it either as a podcast or watch again as a video or disseminate it more widely amongst your networks. We are planning to continue this series. There's been a bit of a break between the various events because it's just been coordination question, but we plan on trying to cover all of China's borderland powers. And so we're on that note, I will draw us to a close and thank Sasha once again. Unfortunately, we can't applaud, but I will look forward to visiting you in Berlin or hosting you here in Singapore so we can have a drink together and celebrate and I can thank you properly. But on behalf of Young China Watchers, thank you so much for taking time to do this. We'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Pleasure being with you.